In this video, I want to talk about a kind of broad introduction to Kabbalah, to think about why did Kabbalah emerge as a way of thinking about God in particular and humans' relationship with God. This had a lot of implications for um, why or how Jews who practiced Kabbalah understood their performance of the commandments of halakha. So, Kabbalah basically addresses some really big questions that we might see across time in Judaism and even in other forms of Judaism that were happening in the medieval period, such as philosophy. But it seems to be the case that more people were persuaded by the teachings of Kabbalah, or perhaps compelled or comforted, or found it answering their questions in a way that simply satisfied them more. Um, so some of those questions would be, first of all, I think a basic question for any tradition that believes in God, particularly a single infinite God, which is how can humans interact with that God? That if I close my eyes and I try to think of infinity, I can't do that, right? So people practicing Kabbalah are trying to think about, what do I think of during prayer, for example? How do I try to focus my thoughts on God without basically blaspheming, without just thinking of an old man with a beard or something like this? That both philosophers and Kabbalists in the medieval period thought that that really wasn't the right way to think about God. And so some other issues come up. And a central one for understanding Kabbalah is ideas about language. Can human words describe God? So a part of that is even thinking about the verse from Genesis where God says, let us make man in our image, or let us make humans in our image. What does that mean? What is God's image, and what part of us is like God? Is that language reasonable? How can it be misleading? How, if we understand it correctly, can it tell us something about the nature of God and how to pray? So people who we see writing in Kabbalah, especially in the Zohar, the central text, but also in other texts, in the Behir, the Book of Splendor, in later texts such as Isaac Luria's from the late medieval period, they find a kind of freedom in contradictions, and I want to make sense of that in some of the later discussions. But a central principle is that language doesn't map one-to-one with the reality of the universe, and that actually we have to let go of an idea that language can do that. For people who practice philosophy, that meant being very, very, very careful about what words they could use and how they could use them. But for people who practiced Kabbalah, they kind of take this idea of metaphor and run. That any language, in fact, is okay, as long as you know that it's all metaphor. And so this kind of is the way that Kabbalah develops out of some of the older practices of reading the Hebrew Bible that we talked about with the rabbis. So, for example, fourfold exegesis, that there is a plain or surface meaning of the text, but that then there's a metaphorical, maybe an allegorical, and even more so, an esoteric or a kind of secret interpretation that's passed from teacher to student if and when the teacher decides that a student is ready. So when we're talking about Kabbalah in the medieval period, we're talking about a practice that was only for men. They had to be 40. They theoretically had to be well versed in Talmud and the Hebrew Bible before maybe someone would decide that they're ready to start learning these other teachings. People thought that on the one hand, these ideas were freeing, but on the other hand, that they were very complicated and potentially dangerous. So as we think about what is God, or how is God described, and how is an experience of God possible through the practices of Kabbalah, I think we want to focus on the idea that language is used in complicated ways, that those old practices of reading, of fourfold exegesis are still in play, but they're kind of flipped on their head. The esoteric becomes more important, and we hear a lot of metaphors one after the other, and so part of our task is simply to understand those metaphors.